Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Ravlick and thank you so much for joining me for this podcast. It's almost 20 years, 2 decades since 9/11, the series of attacks that brought a new kind of terrorism in some respects on American soil. It seems a bit curious that in 2 decades on, we're talking about terrorism and focusing on it again, but it's got a slightly different flavour. And that comes out of people examining what happened in the Capitol on January 6th when a raft of different groups got together to go into the centre of American democracy. Now, this warrants a bit of an explanation, and my guest today is the perfect person to give it to us. I'm talking with Colin Clarke, Director of Policy and Research at the Soufan Group. He's also an author of 3 books on the subject matter. He's written a book on finance and terrorism called Terrorism Inc., Terrorism, an Essential Reference Guide, and also a book on the death of the caliphate in the Middle East called After the Caliphate. Well, but we're going to explore a few themes that relate to what's been happening now and where things might go. Colin, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Now, but before we dive into all of the things that have been going on, because the world's a bit dynamic at the moment, what would your career look like to those people who don't know you yet if you had to spell it out on the back of an envelope?
Yeah, well, I was actually, excuse me, I was a college senior in studying abroad at the University of Galway in Ireland, studying terrorism actually, but ethno-nationalist terrorism. I was studying the implications of the Good Friday Agreement, which had occurred 3 years prior. And my first day, literally my first day of class, happened to be Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. It was a bit of a surreal experience being abroad when that happened, especially being a New Yorker. And it really just kind of, I thrust myself into terrorism studies and studying not Western Europe, but South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and jihadi groups like Al Qaeda. So, as they say, the rest is history. But in those intervening 20 years, I've spent 10 of them, a decade at the Rand Corporation. Got my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh, spent time teaching at Carnegie Mellon University, and then have been affiliated with the Soufan Center and the Soufan Group for the past several years. It's kind of amazing to me because I'm now working for Ali Soufan, who is somebody I read about and his role in, investigating the 9/11 hijackers and the attacks way back when I was a graduate student, when I read Lawrence Wright's epic book, The Looming Tower. So it's a bit of a kind of all things have come full circle. And I continue to work on issues of terrorism, counterterrorism, and political violence. Last several years, in addition to my work on Salafi jihadism, I've been looking at white supremacy, neo-Nazis, and now what we call here in the States domestic violent extremists or racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists.
That's an area that's of interest in Australia at the moment as well. Our federal parliament has got an inquiry that is running. In fact, submissions are due this week looking at the area of extremism and radicalisation, particularly focused on right-wing extremism and jihadist extremism. Now, I think people generally understand what we talk about when we talk about sort of global jihadism. When we look at the right-wing extremism side of life, Colin, it can get a bit hazy for people. What are the conceptual scaffolds? What's the underlying ideology, the strains of thought that we see through for want of a better term, that sort of alt-right type scenario?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I look at the far right as a very large umbrella, and you've got a number of groups that exist underneath this umbrella. You've got what I would call anti-government extremists, including armed militias. and those are groups like the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters. You've got you know, traditional racist groups like white supremacists, neo Nazis, skinheads, and others. And clearly they're motivated by race, hatred of African Americans, hatred of um, people of various religions, Jews, Catholics. They pretty much hate anyone that isn't like them. Then you've got one of the new wrinkles here. We've got this very strange conspiracy movement called QAnon, which you're aware about, and that's it's really hard to describe QAnon. I mean, it's really a conspiracy theory. There's a heavy dose of anti-Semitism in there, which is accommodated by this kind of broader far right umbrella. Um, and then you've got people that are unaffiliated, people that just kind of sample, like almost like a buffet from each of these different forms of extremism, and they're, I'd call them lone actors. They believe they're part of this kind of broader movement. And then you've got groups like the Proud Boys, which are even harder to kind of characterize. I mean, it's kind of a misogynist ideology, chauvinist, Western chauvinist, I think is how they describe themselves. So it's really a kind of grab bag of, formal groups and organizations, but also individuals and movements. Very hard to kind of paint with one broad brush. And I think it's important to understand the nuance, the differences, and the details that make up this kind of broader far right.
Let's take the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters for the moment. Um, they interest me in some respects because they tend to be anti-state, don't they? They have a particular view about the Constitution and an obligation to defend the Constitution, not necessarily those that are elected in Congress or elsewhere. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, that's how they position themselves. Although, when pressed, I would guarantee you that a healthy portion of these people have actually never read the Constitution. One of the things that we witness here in the United States is people are learning their history through memes. Even the Three Percenters is a misnomer. It's based on this, historical, inaccurate uh, notion that only 3% of Americans fought in the American Revolution. So there's a lot of myth, there's a lot of kind of lore, much of it historically inaccurate. For people that are very motivated by the Second Amendment, I doubt very much that they know what the Fifth or the Eighth or right. These aren't constitutional scholars. These are people, in many respects, that you're right. They're against the government, but even within that, there's contradictory thinking that goes along, and we've seen a lot of people attracted to that. One group we didn't mention or one movement is the Boogaloo Boys, which is also very hard to characterize, but they look like a militia. They're armed, heavily armed, and they kind of wear Hawaiian shirts and other, strange apparel that's linked back to internet culture. That many of them are on the right, but some are on the left. Some supported Black Lives Matter. So again, I think you know domestic extremism, far right extremism here in the United States in 2021, far more diverse than anything we've dealt with in quite a long time, which makes it more difficult for the authorities.
Is it, see, given your background, you look at jihadists um, a fair bit. How how much more difficult is it in dealing with the right wing, the sort of extreme right, versus looking at the jihadist uh, phenomenon, which uh, listeners to this will broadly know as being sort of Al Qaeda and Islamic State, and
Mm-hmm.
both those two organisations still kicking around.
No
Um,
question. Yeah, I think what I would say there is we got hit so hard by Al Qaeda on 9/11. We spent the better part of, you know, the next 20 years building this worldwide architecture to fight against these organizations and their affiliates worldwide, from the Middle East to the Sahel to Southeast Asia. And there's a lot of criticism that goes with the global war on terrorism, much of it warranted. But at the same time, one of the things that gets overlooked is the United States was quite effective in dismantling Al Qaeda, and causing it to kind of fracture and limiting its leadership, and is now working its way through the Islamic State. There's pluses and minuses there. I mean, certainly, the caliphate's been destroyed, the physical caliphate, but ISIS lives on through its regional affiliates, and could very well mount a comeback at some point in parts of Iraq and Syria. But I think in other ways, the domestic violent extremist threat is is similarly challenging because one, these are folks that aren't overseas; they're here. This is a home game for us. This is American soil, right? And with ISIS and Al Qaeda, a big part of what we were doing was playing defense. Trying to prevent them from getting into the country, protecting our assets overseas. But now you have extremists that are on American soil and, to boot, have access to sophisticated weaponry that's not illegal to acquire. I mean, the issue here in the United States. Um, we're armed to the teeth. And you layer on top of that a COVID-19 pandemic where people are anxious, they're angry, maybe they've lost their jobs. So it makes for a kind of toxic combination. One thing I will say in terms of an advantage that at least federal law enforcement has here in the U.S. dealing with domestic violent extremists compared to Salafi jihadists is infiltrating these groups, right? With Al Qaeda and ISIS to try to infiltrate and snuff out supporters here in the U.S., there was more of a barrier to entry in terms of kind of understanding language, culture, history, whatever. That's not the same with these militia groups. I mean, the FBI did a great job in the 1990s of infiltrating these groups, um, and I expect they're going to make a concerted effort to do so, and likely are doing so right now. Um, so there's pros and cons here compared to the jihadist fight. There's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences.
Well, the FBI would just really need to do, in the case of domestic uh, terror groups, if we can use the term loosely, that what they've done for years with groups like the New York Mafia. Um, it's a kind of um, I guess it's a thing that they're able to do. They can blend in more easily. I can imagine it'd be tough trying to infiltrate a jihadist group. Period. It wouldn't be that easy to do.
Yeah, and there's talk of that using the RICO laws in this country, racketeering and corruption and other elements to look at the domestic threat. I'll say, as someone that's worked on terrorism financing and as someone that's now looking at this from a domestic perspective, there's a lot that we don't know. That's a major blind spot that a lot of people are looking to kind of scrounge up data on, including myself. How does this movement, how do these people fund themselves? Is there a connection to elements overseas? My gut instinct says yes, but again, you have to be able to prove it. And then, some of these people, they don't require much, right? So they're self-financed. They have day jobs, right? They're moonlighting as anti-government extremists, uh, which again is, has its pros and cons. So I think we're in the very early stages of trying to wrap our heads around this problem. So some people have said that, you know, what we saw at the Capitol on January 6th was the logical culmination of 4 years of Trump. But, I think frankly it's the beginning. It's not the end. And that's unfortunate
Um,
because we've got our hands full.
let me take that last observation you just made and challenge it.
Sure.
Um, it, it, oh, those that argue that it's a culmination of 4 years of Trump might have a point. Um, Equally, there's a point in saying, well, it's possibly just the beginning. I'd argue that it's a continuum because these people have always been there, surely.
Yeah, that's fair. No, I
And the
think
only
you're I
thing,
think you're right about that.
and the only thing that's given them currency is the cover that some of uh, the rhetoric and the environment that Trump set up, um, he's literally giving them cover to live a fantasy.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I wrote a piece in the LA Times in late November um, where I said Trump's rhetoric, right, is going to lead to future violence, and people called me an alarmist and all sorts of other names. And it gives me no great joy to sit here and say, look, I was right. It's like I'm sitting here trying to take a victory lap. This is my country that's being torn apart. This impacts me personally. It has in my own personal life, where I've seen people, that I know, fall under the sway of becoming what I call a MAGA zealot. I mean, people that didn't care at all about politics their whole life became rabid Trump supporters. I don't know how that happens, and are willing to take pretty extreme stances in some cases. So that's one of the things that gets lost in the media. When we're talking about QAnon and the terrorist threat, real families and real friendships are being torn apart in this country, and I don't think we quite understand, the damage to our social fabric. Uh, we're in a strange place here in the United States, not only due to COVID-19, but that's a big part of it. And it feels, President Biden's talked a lot about unity, and for good reason. I mean, we feel more divided than I can remember at any point in my lifetime.
The interesting issue that emerges when we look at uh, the the words. You mentioned the words. You mentioned the conditioning that um, President Trump did while he was still in office. Uh, I recently wrote a piece for Crikey, a news organisation here, looking at that very topic, given that an American social psychologist, Gordon Allport, spelt a lot of this out back in 1954 in his book, The Nature of Prejudice. And the words have consequences, don't they?
Yeah, words do matter. And I think that's something we've struggled to realize here in the United States. Obviously, we have the First Amendment, and we value that dearly. But one of the things that unfortunately I've noticed in our culture is a lack of accountability. Elites are no longer, I don't know if they ever were, but they're certainly now not held accountable. And that's not only on Wall Street or in Hollywood, but it's in the US government. If you look at some of the rhetorical support provided to the insurrectionists on January 6th, that was coming from people in Congress that were enabling that and facilitating it and encouraging it. But there's no sanction for these people. So, what would prevent them from doing it again? And words do matter. We had, President Trump, who has, arguably the biggest bully pulpit in the world, uh, for 4 years, saying things that provided comfort and quarter to elements of the far right. I mean, after Charlottesville, it was good people on both sides. That was a dog whistle. By his debate with President Biden, it was stand back and stand by to the Proud Boys. So it grew into a bullhorn. And he was criticized in the media, but he was certainly never held accountable by his own party, who were scared of him, and the popularity that he had amongst his base. So again, I don't think this is over by any stretch. I mean, I think we're highly divided. Many people in this country erroneously believe that the election was stolen, which there's no evidence of, and they see the Biden administration's illegitimate. And if you've studied the history of terrorism, insurgency, and political violence, illegitimacy is a motivating factor for people that go on to commit violent acts. They think that they have right on their side.
There's another interesting issue that arises when we talk about terrorism in the modern day, and that is electronic communication, particularly social media, but increasingly encrypted apps. Uh, how do you see the trend that we've noticed both in the case of Facebook and Twitter of deplatforming certain actors, but those actors then going into other areas, finding homes on Telegram, on Gab, and elsewhere? They never really go away, do they?
No, they're pushed to more, marginalized or fringe platforms where they become more difficult to monitor in some cases. But I'm still, of the mind that getting them off these mainstream platforms is better in the long run because they're not able to reach as many people. Uh, but it's going to be a constant cat and mouse game. There's no question about it. And I think, as encryption continues to be a debated issue, we're likely to see a move further in that direction, right? As people value privacy over, security or whatever the trade-off is. It's not that simple. And Silicon Valley is not super popular at the moment in the United States, particularly for hosting and proliferating disinformation. So I think this tech security nexus is something that will be, um, really one of the defining issues, at least in terrorism, over the next 4 or 5 years.
It seems to be a challenge to manage some of the uh, more extreme material being distributed though on encrypted apps. You could once you remove someone from a Facebook, for example, and you keep them away from a broader audience, they're still able to groom, if you like, a core, and it doesn't take many people to do harm. And it's one of the things that I've come across in looking at public channels on Telegram, where even the footage of the Christchurch um, massacre back in March 2019, yeah, no longer available on Facebook. It was streamed on Facebook, but there are copies of it everywhere. And I wrote about it last year in the same online news service, and that's a particular concern um, for me in any case. How do you see that ability for people to get groomed, you know, outside of the purview um, of a general kind of monitoring?
Yeah, it's just one of those things that I think, as counterterrorism analysts and practitioners, we have to understand that we're never going to get to zero. We're never going to reduce all attacks, right? It's not about defeating terrorism. It's one of the reasons I thought the global war on terrorism as a name was so counterproductive, right? It suggests an end. It's a tactic. We're never going to fully defeat terrorism. And frankly, we're unlikely to defeat terrorist networks like Al Qaeda, um, or ISIS. So, I look at it the same way. We're never going to be able to fully remove these videos and images from the internet. Can we mitigate their presence? That's the real question. And can we, mitigate them from motivating people to be copycats or to use as motivation, and that's hard, if not impossible, to do. You could probably still find Anwar al-Awlaki videos online, and we know how important he was as a motivator to individuals who committed a number of jihadi attacks. Look at Alex Hitchens' book Incitement, which is a kind of real one of the best case studies out there on this topic.
Yeah, I'm well aware of the issues that Anwar al-Awlaki posed, and certainly well aware of what happened to him as a consequence. You mentioned the notion of minimising the impact, which I think it probably we're talking about the principle of containment. How do we contain this as opposed to eliminate it? How effective do you think the approach taken by the Canadian government recently to prescribe organisations like the Atomwaffen division, the Proud Boys, the Russian Imperial movement, and some others, is in trying to contain those organisations and their activity.
Sorry, can you repeat that last part? I cut out for a sec.
How do you, how important do you think the approach to prescribing organisations the way Canada has done is to trying to contain these groups?
Yeah, I think it is important. And I'm aware of there's kind of multiple sides here in the debate. people that are a bit more reluctant to start prescribing groups because they are concerned that this could be abused, right? And that politicians could start prescribing, groups that aren't really terrorist groups, but are kind of more political adversaries, and or just using designation as a tool in an unwieldy way. I mean, that's a big part of the debate here in the United States now. Do we need new laws to deal with this threat? One school of thought says, no, we have the laws we need. We just need to begin enforcing them, and suggesting it's a matter of political will. Others say we need a brand new domestic terrorism statute that is the equivalent of an FTO designation, foreign terrorist organization designation that the State Department has. And yet others, and this is something that I kind of advocated in a piece that I wrote in the New York Times a few weeks ago, advocate making domestic terrorism a federal crime, which is a kind of middle ground between not doing anything and passing a new statute. It gives law enforcement more tools and more resources, but it stops short of creating a domestic terrorism statute. I'm also on the record of saying, look, I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm willing to have this debate. Let's be transparent about it. Let's bring in all the experts and the smartest people working on this topic, and let's do what a democracy does and debate it and vote on it and make sure that we know what the pitfalls are, what the advantages are. Like, why don't we have these debates anymore? I hope we will. The Biden administration has a real sense of urgency about this threat, and I know really smart people, very people that are dedicated to the United States and national security working on this topic. So I'm hopeful, more hopeful than I've been in some time, that we can make progress in this on this topic in this area, by the end of the year.
One of the most important things that we need to understand uh, about the phenomenon we're talking about is how we deal with it uh, today, but also how we deal with it in the future. Uh, how important is it for the education system in countries like the United States and I guess even in Australia to ensure that people are taught critical thinking, are taught philosophy, are taught comparative religion um, in order to start breaking down the aspects of fear, lack of understanding. Because a lot of what we see in terrorism appears to be related to um, certain bad actors playing on other people's vulnerabilities and fear to recruit them to a cause. How do we break that down?
It's a huge component. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. The problem is, and I don't know if it's a problem as much as a challenge, this is a long term issue. Education is critical, but it's not going to happen overnight. I mean, it's a generational change. I'll go back to my comment earlier of people are learning history through memes. That includes not only how people are learning American history, but how they're learning world history. One of the things we're seeing now is that the younger generation knows very little about the Holocaust. Now, why is that? Is it not being taught in schools the same way? I mean, when I went to school, that was, a big part of our education was learning about this horrific world event so as not to repeat it and to learn about, the real crimes that took place. I mean, it was horrific, as you know. But kids today are being introduced to this event through memes that sometimes soft pedal it or downplay it, and we see it, being turned into a joke that white supremacists then kind of use in meme form to kind of get people to laugh. And if you're willing to laugh at 6 million people being killed, what else are you willing to believe or laugh at? And we know that anti-Semitism is a huge component of the far right. I mean, just look at the clothing of some of the individuals that were at the Capitol. One guy had a shirt that said Camp Auschwitz. Other people were holding signs that said 6 million wasn't enough in reference to the number of Jews killed. I mean, just really, base, abhorrent type behavior from American citizens. And I do think quite a bit of this has to goes back to education. And then also disinformation, QAnon, right? Like digital literacy is something that's lacking in this country at all age levels and all kind of socioeconomic and demographic background. So that's something that needs to change too.
Out of all of it, we've outlined a whole bunch of stuff in that response. Um, what is it? What What do you think ought to be the first thing that authorities need to touch on?
I think identifying, the most violent actors in this movement and seeing what crimes they've committed. First, I would demand accountability for the actions of January 6th, and the FBI's in the process of doing that. But then, kind of mapping out these networks. Look, don't we talk about international terrorism and domestic terrorism? Just because you're an American, you don't get a free pass. Like, you don't get treated with kid gloves. Let's treat this. Let's be agnostic to the ideology that motivates terrorism, while at the same time understanding it or trying to understand it. But terrorism is terrorism, and these people need to be held accountable, right? And we wouldn't let international networks proliferate overseas. So why would we let them, manifest and, uh, you know, catalyze on U.S. soil? We shouldn't.
Is the problem at the heart of all of this that there are white people doing things that we oftentimes look into the Middle East and see people that we call another doing?
I think that's part of it. I mean, that's been no question. That's been a struggle here in the United States with that. This is no longer a minority issue. There's a double standard, and anyone tells you that there isn't is lying or simply confused. I mean, go to the Nashville bombing on Christmas Day. There was a bombing in a major American city that could have killed a lot of people. I mean, we're lucky that it didn't. That individual was reported by his girlfriend the year before that he was building a bomb in his trailer. Now, if that was a Muslim guy or a brown guy, he wouldn't have had a second chance to detonate it. He would have been investigated and probably arrested. You know, so there's long been a double standard the way that we look at terrorism. I hope that's changing. It needs to change because insurrectionists should be given no quarter. This is a country that stands for democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and that needs to be applied across the board.
Colin, I'm very mindful of the time, and you've been very gracious with your time today. Uh, Before we close off, you've got 3 books that you've written. They all cover the area of terrorism. Where can people uh, get they want to follow through after they listen to this? Where can people buy them?
They should all be available on Amazon.com. The Terrorism Inc. and the Essential Reference Guide are both through ABC Clio, Prager Security International, and After the Caliphate is published by Polity Press in the UK.
The other thing, you obviously, when I introduced you, I spoke about the Soufan Group. There's an excellent resource that comes out every single day from the Soufan Centre, which is the Intelli Brief. I encourage people to go to the Soufan Centre's website and subscribe. I read it every day, Colin.
Thanks, that's flattering.
I have to. It's one of the things that I read. It comes out early in the evening. I look at it every day. Today's one was fantastic. Colin, thank you for joining me. It's been an insightful and it's been an absolute privilege to chat with you today.
Pleasure's been mine. Look forward to chatting again.
Oh, let's do it again before long. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you.